All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Austin Bowman. I'm an urban designer in the Urban Design Center, a division of Raleigh Planning and Development, and a member of the Western Project team. I'd like to welcome you all this evening to this virtual Q&A and thank you for taking the time to join this meeting. I wanted to get started with a few short housekeeping items before we get into the event. I'd like to remind you all that you can either use the chat feature to the right of your streaming video, or you can call in and the phone number is right above your video player. I would like to ask everyone to please keep your comments to both the panelists and to one another respectful and productive this evening so that we can get through as many questions as possible. We're going to start with a short presentation by Danya Sandeep, who is the project manager from the city of Raleigh, and Morgan McLean, who is managing this project from the consultant team, WSP. After this presentation, I will introduce the rest of the panel and we will take questions as they come in. And with that, I will hand things off to Danya and Morven.
Thank you, Austin. Good evening, everyone. Once again, my name is Danya Sandeep. I am one of the senior urban designers with the City of Raleigh Planning and Development, also serving as project manager for the Western Boulevard Corridor Study. First off, on behalf of my entire project team, I want to thank you all for connecting to this virtual engagement session and also for your continued engagement with this project all along. I want to take a moment to acknowledge what we understand that we are going through some very difficult times with the global pandemic. And if you have been impacted, you and your families have been impacted with this, we are sorry, but we certainly hope that the situation would get better and that we get out of this safe and well. Now, it's been quite a while since we connected with you all on this project, and we've reached a point where we have some great updates to share. And so we're very glad to have this opportunity to connect with all of you through our virtual platform. So in a moment, I'm going to start a presentation. We have a very brief presentation. Again, now just going through some quick summary and highlights. And the hope is that you have had a chance to review all of the material we shared on our virtual engagement website that we released and launched a couple of weeks ago. So our goal today is to reserve most of our time to hear from you. We want to listen to your questions, and we have a great panel of our project team experts also from the consultant side, looking forward to hearing from you. So with that, I'm going to now start sharing the screen and we will dive into the presentation. I hope you can see this, and I'm going to dive right into it. So a quick background, I think most of you may know this, but I wanted to remind everyone that the Western Boulevard Corridor Study is really part of a larger planning effort, looking at transit improvements for the entire region. And I think that you all know what the plan is. It's the Wake County Transit Plan adopted in 2016. Now, there are four major moves or key recommendations coming out of that plan, and that is to connect the region, connect all Wake County communities, and to provide reliable and frequent transit, and to provide greater access to transit overall. So the bus rapid transit, or the BRT as we all call it, is really one of the strategies to accomplish many of those goals stated in the Wake County plan. So what exactly is BRT? BRT is essentially an enhanced bus service system with added amenities. We could have, in most cases, we have dedicated bus lanes, so and also prioritize signals. So the buses do get priority at signals, so it makes for faster, more reliable service. You could have added amenities such as off-board fare collection or level boarding. And overall, all of these amenities really makes for a more reliable, frequent transit service and a much more enjoyable experience if you want to ride the bus. So there are four major BRT corridors recommended in the Wake County plan, and all four are underway in different planning and design phases. The first in line is the New Bern corridor, which just completed the 30% design, and we are moving now into the final design contract or design phase. The southern corridor is in the process of evaluating the locally preferred alternatives, and a recommendation is anticipated by the end of this year. The northern corridor will start some level of planning and work later this year into early next year. And then, of course, we have a western corridor, which is the focus of our discussion. And this is in the planning phase. We hope to finish up the planning phase by early next year. In the meantime, we are also expecting the design contract to start by late fall of this year. So quick recap of the planning study scope. Again, the goal of this study is really to connect how well we can effectively connect the bus rapid transit between downtown Raleigh and downtown Cary. And so what we're looking in the process, we also included properties within half-mile radius of the potential BRT corridors. And the reason is that within half-mile, we typically relate those to as a 10-minute walk. And I think most of us know that for a BRT to be successful, we want to make sure that the corridor can connect well to the surrounding areas and neighborhoods to ensure that we can encourage more transit ridership. A quick look at the contract. Now we do have, we hired a consultant team, WSP is the lead consultant. There are a couple of subs who've been helping them as well. But the contract, and I want to make a point here. I think those of you who have been engaged with our corridor planning efforts in the past, this is a slightly different simply because in the process to normally that we approach a corridor planning effort, we have 2 years time frame. We are looking at more of a visionary approach, looking at great opportunities in the near and long term. However, because this is BRT oriented, our scope is very confined. And it is because we know that BRT is coming along this corridor. And so the entire focus is how best can we integrate BRT along Western Boulevard, at the same time connecting some of the key destinations along the way. So one of the key goals that we had in the contract for our consultants to help with is to identify the preferred BRT alignment. In the previous map, you saw that there were 3 multiple alignments. And so we now have a recommendation from the team. We also wanted to look at development capacity or potential along this corridor to support transit-oriented development. And in the process, also coordinate with other active projects. We have several of our external partners, such as NCDOT and NC State, who have a lot of overlapping projects that impacts this corridor. So primarily, much of the consultant work really evolved around very technical analysis and details, multimodal safety analysis, transit, land use, and market analysis. And you will get more update and more questions answered because we have the consultant team available today. The next is the urban design. Now, this is a section that is new. We added this on. This is not part of the consultant contract. This was crafted by the design center team, which is the team I work with. Our group got together and we looked at opportunities. Again, we did have we had some extra time because of the pandemic. And so we thought, well, we had consultants who did some technical analysis and we wanted to leverage that and look at design opportunities, specifically with the vision of how best can we transform Western Boulevard from an auto-centric corridor to one that serves multimodal users. So we had taken the opportunity to look at overall connectivity, looking at ways we can ensure that pedestrian, bicycle and greenway access and network can be enhanced. In the process, also looking at safety for all users, also looking at key infrastructure improvements that presents itself along with the BRT design, especially looking at critical intersections for possible redesign, looking at new streets that could enhance overall connectivity. So a lot of that work has been done and we have some recommendations online. And then also to look at public realm, right? Because we all understand how important it is. It's not just about providing services, but to ensure that that experience that the riders have to go through when you connect from stops or the first and last mile is really important. So to ensure that we have enough open space and public realm opportunities to enhance that experience. And last but not least, equitable development around transit. If you've been engaged with our planning efforts, you know that this is a plan that has been going on for more than a year. We are now in the process of reviewing the final draft. Council has the recommendations. So this lays the framework, and there are some key design guidelines recommended by the EDAP plan. And our goal is to enhance and take that further along and make some specific recommendations for the corridor. And I also want to make a quick note. We have an image showing on the slide, and this really reminds us a lot of the context of Western Boulevard. So a point to note is that TOD comes in different scale and context. So, and in the EDAT report, you will see that there are different station typologies that go with different scales and context. So as we move away from downtown, moving further west, you are going to come across different scales and densities of TOD, just because the context varies as you move through the corridor. And I think I touched on this, again, the focus areas for urban design, infrastructure improvements, placemaking, but also sustainability. And again, we all understand how important this is for everyone. We hear a lot, and we want to make sure that redevelopment opportunities also consider a more sustainable approach, how green infrastructure can be effectively integrated, and also in the process, make sure we are protecting our natural resources. Again, a quick note, we are excited. We have been monitoring some of the comments and feedback we received on our survey, and we have an overwhelming response and feedback about the need for prioritizing bicycle and pedestrian networks and greenway access. And we hear you loud, and we certainly will make that as a priority as we look for opportunities to enhance this corridor. These are sample, again, these are teasers because I really hope you will go through our website and look at it, but just one quick shot at how we have looked at the entire corridor. Again, dividing the corridor into more segments based on the existing scale and character. And as I mentioned, as we move away from downtown, you are going to see a very different context, and the opportunities and challenges that each segment presents are very different. This is again a sample of our street connectivity maps. Please again do look online and give us feedback. We would love to know and hear from you if we have missed any opportunities to enhance connectivity across. And this is again just a sample of just one way of how we have approached the urban design solutions. This is just a South Saunders intersection, again looking at multiple ways, adding street grids, looking at the bridge and seeing how we could add some lighting materials, wayfinding to enhance the placemaking aspect, looking at right of way and how we can better enhance so there's seamless connection from between corridors into the BRT. And again, connectivity across. So a lot of times we think of Western Boulevard as a barrier, but it doesn't have to be that way. And we can find ways to how you can better connect between north and south, especially for this intersection, looking at improving that connectivity for the south to Dix and across. So with that, that was a quick review. Again, I do hope you get to navigate our site. And we are going to have a larger focus on urban design at the very next public meeting sometime in early spring. And now I'm going to pass it on to Morgan McLean. She is with our project lead with the consultant team WSP. And Morgan.
Yes, thank you, Danya. So next we're going to talk a bit about how the preferred BRT route was selected between Raleigh and Cary. And that is known as a locally preferred alternative, or LPA. So a prior study had identified a couple of routing options in the corridor. As you can see, all routes leave downtown Raleigh and run along Western Boulevard until about Jones Franklin. And then there were a couple of other options that were presented. One runs along Chapel Hill Road, one along East Chatham, and then the south route connected to Carytown Boulevard and then on into Walnut Street to connect downtown Cary. A fourth route was identified working with the town of Cary. That's the route you see in purple on your screen. And that also uses the western extension to connect to Carytown and then takes a right turn onto Maynard Road to get into downtown Cary. The East Chatham alternative alignment was eliminated as a large portion of that roadway is within the railroad right-of-way, which gives us some constructability issues and concerns. And also the railroad acts as a barrier to the desired development we're looking for on both sides of the BRT line. The Western Carytown and Walnut route was also eliminated. The Walnut Street section of that route within the town of Cary has very limited development potential. So then we looked at the two remaining alternatives, the Chapel Hill Road alternative and the Western Carytown Maynard route, and we analyzed them based on whether they support existing transportation plans, whether they align with public input, whether they provide equitable service to people who rely upon and depend upon transit to get around, and whether they connect people to destinations. The extension of Western Boulevard to connect to Cary Town has been an approved project in the city's street plan for many years, and also the larger metropolitan transportation plan. Public outreach was conducted in 2017 and 2018, and respondents were asked to voice their preferred route. As you can see, there was a strong preference expressed for the Carytown Western route. 37% of Raleigh respondents and 39% of respondents overall preferred the south alignment. And then in November of last year at our public open house, we asked you which destinations you felt were important to connect to with this new BRT service. And the response was that upcoming developments in Cary, the Fenton development in East Cary, and the new plans for Cary Town Centre were very important to connect to with BRT, along with significant destinations in Raleigh, such as NC State and Dorothea Dix Park. Providing equitable service to those who depend on transit is an important focus. And as you can see here, when we looked at the two alternatives and considered the number of zero-car households and people and families living in poverty in both routes, we see that the Western Carytown Maynard route will serve a much higher transit-dependent population. And so the preferred route has been endorsed by both Town of Cary Council and City of Raleigh Council, and it is the Western Carytown Maynard alternative. And this is just a close-in of the locally preferred alternative. And next, we will give you an update on the land use study portion of our project. So here our goal is to really understand the development potential in the corridor. We want to understand how the corridor can grow and change around this new BRT service that's being introduced. We've completed an analysis of existing zoning within the City of Raleigh. We've taken a look at the market for development, whether residential, office, or commercial development would grow and thrive within the corridor. We've also completed a land use capacity analysis. So we'll talk quite a bit this evening about transit-oriented development, or TOD. So what do we mean by that exactly? We just mean creating walkable communities. So vibrant, compact, mixed-use communities within walking distance of public transportation, which reduces the need for driving and parking. Equitable development around transit is an important focus for the City of Raleigh, and the city has recently published the Equitable Transit-Oriented Development Guidebook. This provides a policy toolkit for the city, some development goals and design principles, and also assigns some station area types. So each of the planned BRT stations in the Western Corridor has been assigned a station typology. 5 have been defined, and you see here that's envisioned there will be a downtown BRT station, an emerging urban center, a smaller neighborhood center, and then BRT stations that will serve campus areas and parks. So we've completed a soft site analysis, and this is looking at parcels that have a high potential to redevelop in the future over a long-term time period. Here we're looking at sites within a quarter mile of the BRT alignment. And as you can see, we found a sizable acreage of soft sites, almost 240 acres. The important point to note here is that nearly 70% of these soft sites are associated with non-residential or vacant parcels. And building on that soft site analysis, we then looked at two scenarios for growth, a baseline scenario and a TOD scenario. And the baseline scenario assumes the city implements no significant policy changes to allow for or encourage higher density development. But the TOD scenario assumes the city adopts policies to encourage TOD, such as infrastructure improvements. And you can see that under the TOD scenario, there's the potential to grow by more than 50% in residential units and up to 100% growth in commercial areas versus the baseline scenario. So where are we in the project timeline? We're at checkpoint 2. This is our virtual engagement period. As you can see, the bulk of the project work has now been completed. The next step is to create a final report, which will be presented to and adopted by Raleigh City Council. Thank you to all of you who have engaged and left us feedback at the website. I want you to know that the survey continues to be open through October 19th, so we're looking for continued input and feedback. The city is looking at early spring of 2021 for the next public meeting on this project. And a parallel project to begin preliminary design in this corridor is anticipated to begin later this fall. And I'll throw it back to you, Austin. Thank you.
Thanks, Danya. Thanks, Morven. Before we get to the questions, I just wanted to really briefly introduce each of the panelists who will be answering your questions this evening. And just to let you know, this group, we are going to do our best to answer all of your questions. If a question comes up that we would feel would be better answered by someone who's not on the call with us this evening, we will document that question and post the answer as part of a forthcoming FAQ that will be posted on the project page. So we hope we can answer as many of your questions as possible tonight, but rest assured they will get answered. So with all of that, let's get started, and I'll start with introductions. You've already met Danya and Morven. Next, we have John Loughran with WSP. He's the senior urban strategist with WSP who has worked on land use elements of the study. We also have Kyle Vangel, principal with HR&A Advisors, to take questions on the market analysis portion of the study. And Mila Vega from the City of Raleigh, who is the project manager for our entire BRT program. We have 5 callers who have called into the live session, and we're actually going to start with those, and then we'll work our way through questions that have been left in the chat. And I would be remiss if I did not give a shout out to Lee Stevens, another urban designer who is running things behind the scenes, making sure your calls are connected and we get to answer your questions. So Lee, if you could put our first caller through. Looks like we might be having small technical hiccup. Let's try again. If you're on the line, please feel free to speak up. All right, well, let's just start answering questions while we figure out what exactly is going on the phone bridge. And the first question that I think several people have, I think Mila can speak to this, is kind of the overall process that each of these corridors, but particularly Western, is going to go through, and the confidence the city has that Western will go into the FTA funding pipeline successfully.
So thank you for the question. These are complex projects that take multiple years to design and construct, and also identify funding. We are certainly working with our local partners through the Wake Transit Plan, as well as our state partners, because for the majority of the project length, we are within the NCDOT right away. As Austin mentioned, we also need to work with our federal partners because the project does rely on federal funding for at least 50%, if not more. The grants are discretionary grants that come from the Federal Transit Administration, so they're not guaranteed. And we will need to meet a list of various requirements to determine project eligibility and determine a timeline when the funding could be received through the FTA. But typically, projects of this scale take approximately 2 to 3 years to get designed, and then construction is contingent upon funding availability. As I mentioned, it's a very complex, long process coordination that requires coordination with the Federal Transit Administration.
Great, thanks, Mila. Our next question, I'm gonna lump some together. We've gotten several questions about outreach regarding the locally preferred alternative, both that took place as part of this Western Boulevard project and as part of the Wake County MIS. So I would like to ask Morven, Danya, and Mila, I think all of you can speak a little bit to this. Can you generally describe the engagement process that the Western Extension in particular went through to be selected as the LPA?
Sure, Austin. Yep, thanks for that question. And I can start just talking about the engagement that we held as part of this project. So that was in November of last year. We had an open house meeting at the McKimmon Center. We had 157 attendees at that meeting, 80 of which participated via a comment wall, a community wall, where we encouraged them to put up sticky notes and give us their feedback. We also had an online survey as part of that engagement, and we had 429 respondents. I think the important question there relative to the LPA is that the majority of respondents, when asked which destinations were important to connect to, 40% of those respondents indicated that Cary Town Centre was an important destination.
Great, thanks, Morven. Danya, Mila, anything to add to that?
I think Morven kind of covered our engagement process, especially through this planning study. I think, I think the MIS already did a lot of outreach, right? And we had a good understanding of where the community stood on what the preference was. We have some stats on that from the effort that the Campo and the Wake County did through that process. So essentially, with this process, it was really confirming some of that input we received. So as Marvin pointed out, we did ask for destinations because it came down to all three had different opportunities and different challenges. And we got an overwhelming response about how people felt like it was important to connect key destinations, especially to downtown Cary and some of the new opportunities that are coming along closer to downtown Cary. So the line selected, again, that also meets the public interest about connecting key destinations, along with, of course, a bunch of other evaluation factors that went into. I don't know if Mila, you had anything to add to that. And I think one thing we kind of touched on, we did have questions, and I want to acknowledge that there were some people who inquired about the Western Extension. So one fact that I know, which again predates way before I joined the city of Raleigh had in the streets plan adopted this new extension as something that was a proposed street network for actually more than 50 years. And it's always been in the books, and it's just didn't have the funding or the opportunity for that. But when Wake County planning process happened, and it was also selected as one of the potential routes for the BRT. So that kind of elevated the status of that street network that's been sitting on for quite a while. So having said that, the city over the many years actually has acquired properties along this new route. So we have almost 85% of the properties acquired along this right of way, and there's only a few more parcels that will have to be acquired to build that road. So I just want to throw that in there. So it's been in the works for a really long time. It's just that now, not just a street, but it's also now going to be BRT route as well.
One thing I would like to add that in addition to focused public engagement for the Western Boulevard Corridor Study and MIS Work Major Investment Study, information regarding the alignments was always shared during the New Bern BRT open houses. We had at least 2 open houses for that corridor, as well as equitable development around transit work, where all discussions always were grounded in the concept of all 4 BRT corridors and various alignments that were considered. So just want to remind about that as well.
Great, thank you all. So we got quite a few questions about what exactly, from a physical perspective, this extension might look like, and overall the BRT road profile, fitting dedicated lanes potentially for buses in there. So I think, Mila, can you broadly describe how the results of this study will be taken into the next phase in the process that all of the projects will go through to define the physical character of the BRT corridors?
So this will start happening in the preliminary design when we begin looking at mixing and matching different segments and looking at mixed traffic, BRT lanes, bus rapid transit lanes along the curb, in the median, the same process that we went through when we originally looked at conceptual design for New Bern Avenue BRT. So from day one, before this design work begins, the consultant team will look at all studies that were conducted in the corridor, all recommendations, and then use that information as the baseline to start developing concepts for various segments along the corridor. That information will be presented to the public, various options will be presented to the public, and then will be refined using public feedback and technical information and feedback from elected officials and with transit planning partners.
Great, thanks, Mila. We got a lot of questions both on the survey and in the chat from people who were concerned about infrastructure along Western Boulevard, both for cyclists and pedestrians. So I think a question for Mila and Danya, specifically, if you can speak to some of the strategies that this study is looking at for those first mile, last mile connections, right? Getting people from their homes, from their places of work to transit facilities. But also broadly, I think a lot of people have questions about how the city might go about encouraging that culture change so that people are using transit and alternative modes of transportation more. So I know that's a broad question, but if either of you could speak to that.
I can start and address some of these considerations along the corridor, and then Danya and Morgan, feel free to provide additional feedback. So looking at bus rapid transit project, whether it's Western Corridor, Southern Corridor, we always look at it from the perspective of multimodal mobility, because somebody who is using a bus is either a pedestrian or a cyclist for a portion of the trip. So the same way that I just described how we're going to be looking at various segments and looking at running way types, we will be looking at feasibility of adding enhanced bicycle and pedestrian facilities along the corridor. That will be happening during the early design phases, and it will go through various iterations. It's a balancing act of trying to include as many enhancements into the project while balancing the budget and balancing right-of-way availability, but that's a step one. And Danya, I don't know if you would like to address some of the work that we think about, we are planning for station area planning.
Right. I think it's a great question. And you know, to start off with, I think a culture change has already happened in Raleigh. I still remember 15 years ago when I joined with the city, you know, we didn't hear a whole lot of, you know, there were advocates, but not as loud. But, today we are in a whole different scenario. I think we have people wanting to, use different modes of transportation. We have seen examples. We just rolled out cycle tracks on West Street. We've, converted Blunt Street, Blunt Street. So we're seeing changes. So I think the shift has already happened. And to note that city also, I guess, endorsed or adopted what is called the Complete Streets policy. The transportation group has already adopted that a few years ago. And so every project we look at now, we look for opportunities to integrate multimodal, accommodation. And so this is no different. And in fact, BRT makes it even more important for us to ensure that we have to plan for pedestrians and bicycle connection. And like I said, in our urban design opportunities work that my team has been doing, we have made some recommendations. What we did, we have the consultants evaluate the existing conditions, especially sidewalk conditions, pedestrian safety, bicyclists, all of those data has been collected. And we use that to make an assessment of, where are those opportunities? What are those gaps? So yes, through this study effort or planning study, I think you will definitely see some recommendations in terms of, looking at maps with showing connectivity gaps, showing bicycle pedestrian connections that we'd like to propose. Now, having said that, I cannot speak to the priority of how these could get implemented. So yes, we're gonna make some recommendations we will have, but how it fits against many of the other infrastructure requirements in the CIP list, that how that shakes out, I cannot speak for. But I think it is really important to understand that, yes, without the success of successful connectivity, the first and half mile to the BRT corridors, we are not going to be as successful because riders need to get to places and you need to provide that connectivity. So it's that how much can you advocate for that is really important. And I think thanks to those of you who have brought it to our attention, we really hope that you would support. And while we make such recommendations, again, go online and do let us know if there are specific hotspots along the corridor that you think provides opportunities for, whether it's bicycle or greenway or pedestrian connections that you really, really want to see. Please mark that so we can really go and evaluate those into our recommendations. Thanks for that.
Great, thank you both. We also got a lot of questions about affordable housing. As you're all aware, it's a really big issue that the city as a whole is facing, and Western Boulevard is not immune to that. So we got several questions, and I think this is John and Kyle, if you could speak to some of the recommendations, both in EDAT, in the equitable development around transit plan, about how we can ensure affordable housing along these BRT corridors, specifically looking at 50% and below AMI. Which is area and median income for anyone watching.
Thanks, Austin. So I'll start on that question first. I think that there are several aspects of the EDAT project, the equitable transit-oriented development recommendations that speak to that goal. As has been noted, those are not yet adopted policy, but the outcomes of that, are really in process with the city council now. One of the key tools is a TOD overlay zone that would enable an affordability bonus, whereby in order to achieve a 50% affordability bonus or 50% density bonus, you would need to be providing affordable housing that is affordable to 50% or below of area median income for 30 years. So I think it's both that depth of affordability and length of affordability that makes it a very strong, very strong policy. In addition to that, there is another concept in the EDAT program of work called the equity fund, which would be sort of like a form of tax increment capture, whereby you pay your property taxes. A portion of those, not yet determined or set in the EDAT program, could potentially be captured in order to fund priorities like affordable housing in different ways. A program like that can really be used to allow for deeper levels of affordability than might otherwise be achievable, as well as complement other affordable housing programs that are already in place. I think another key aspect in the equitable transit-oriented development guidebook that shouldn't be lost is also that it articulates a preference that as these affordable units are created, priority be given through contractual agreements with developers to either current residents of the corridor or former residents of these corridors who have been displaced by the increases in home prices. And I think that that's a very intentional effort to directly connect affordable housing to the communities that have lived in these areas and want to remain residents of the area as there are, improvements like the transit infrastructure that come online.
Thanks, Kyle. John, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I want to add, this is on the topic of equity, housing affordability, preserving existing units, creating more units is part of the equation. But one of the other tools or one of the other goals of the EDAT guidelines is also to preserve existing businesses and expand opportunities for employment. So when we talk about equity, it's, we're approaching it from two perspectives. One is the housing and the affordable housing, the supply, but it's also realizing that you need jobs for preserve existing businesses and create new job opportunities.
Great, thanks for adding that, John. So our next question for Danya, I think, there were some questions about coordination with, since such a large portion of this corridor fronts NC State University, some questions regarding how we're working with them, and particularly on some capital projects that they had planned some time ago at the intersection of Western Boulevard and Avent Ferry that would add a pedestrian tunnel. So if you could kind of speak broadly to that relationship and those capital projects.
Yeah, that's a great question. If you remember when I presented, right, one of the key items we talked about in the scope was this coordination with our external partners. And that's ongoing. We have a consultant team, Marvin, and folks can also speak to that because they've had some very specific meetings with NCDOT and other partners who've had some major capital improvement projects impacting the corridor. But specific to NC State, they are a part, stakeholder, huge stakeholder, in fact, because we have an entire corridor segment that is institutional and occupied by NC State. So we have been coordinating with the group. This pet tunnel project has been one that's been discussed for a really long time. Unfortunately, I don't really have an update on that. I know we touched on that during the Avent Ferry corridor study that I was involved in as well. And we are aware of that having an impact on the BRT design. But the hope is that as we move forward, we are already working with the NC State team. We've had focus group meetings and ongoing coordination is happening. It's just that the timing of how all of that design coordinates with the BRT design is going to be critical. And I think as this project moves into the design phase, we'll make sure that that coordination happens at a final level, because it is really important that everyone's investing and we're all wanting improvements to the corridor. And the last thing you want is to make sure that they all coordinate and fit in. You don't want to plan for something and then later have to dig it up and be just because, we have other plans for a different property on the corridor. So that's an ongoing, and I don't think we can solve that or explain that. It's just going to, happen with time. And as this project moves forward, and we will make sure that when the design contract moves forward for this corridor, Milan team, that we'll make sure that we provide updates on that coordination with all the stakeholders, so that you can be posted and informed of what's happening. But that's a huge piece, and we just don't have enough updates on that as yet.
Great, thanks, Danya. So in both our live chat and the survey, we got several questions regarding the LPA analysis, specifically routes along Hillsborough Street that were not chosen from residents in the area. So Morven, I know we briefly covered this in the presentation, but to reiterate, especially for people who maybe have just joined, can you speak briefly to why ultimately routes along Hillsborough Street were not ultimately considered for the locally preferred alternative?
Sure, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that alternative ultimately had essentially a fatal flaw in our analysis on a couple of fronts. First, the roadway being within the railroad right-of-way creates limitations and questions about how much, if any, infrastructure can be added within the railroad right-of-way. So that was a huge concern with that alternative. And then just in terms of development, we know that BRT succeeds when it connects people to destinations and when people have easy access to the new service, right? And so the proximity of that line to the rail corridor really would act as a barrier to any development or connections north of the rail line. So that alternative was eliminated. And then also, based on public input, we heard twice, once under the MIS, the Major Investment Study outreach, that the preference was for the south route. And once again, when we checked in with the public last year, the preference was for the western Carytown route over the East Chatham alternative.
Thanks, Morven. So our next question, and this is also something that came up quite a bit, particularly for residents who live along what will be the Western Boulevard extension, is, as has been pointed out in our own materials in this engagement process, that is quite an environmentally sensitive area. So Danya, I was wondering if you could speak to some of the work as part of the planning study that's underway that is taking a look at those environmental conditions and coming up with new and innovative solutions that can mitigate the environmental impact of a brand new road going through that area.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad someone brought that up. So I know, this endorsement has been made. So we have been very, very particular about looking at the opportunities along this new street. And one of the concepts or ideas that we are looking at from our urban design team, and actually I would say Austin Bowman, who's in my team, is one of our experts with sustainable urbanism. So actually, Austin, after I'm done, if you want to share your thoughts or comments. So one of the concepts we've been looking at, we understand it's a very environmentally sensitive corridor. And we wanted to come up with some creative, innovative ways in which we can ensure that, we have sustainable urbanism while, we have TOD, which is a given. How can we integrate that through a lens of green or sustainable urbanism, and how do we tie that? So it's a concept we're exploring, and we are very excited about the opportunities that particular section offers, because while there may be challenges, I think there are also opportunities to try out something new and something that is innovative. So we are actually looking and researching, and hopefully by the next public meeting we can have some more recommendations or thoughts to share, because we are just in the process of researching on that. And I'm going to actually let Austin share a little about it, because he's definitely a better person on that. Austin, why don't you share some of the research and things that you're looking at for this?
Sure. So like Danya mentioned, we're actively researching manners in which we can develop these roadways and encourage development in the area that is considerate of environmental conditions and takes into account potential hazards that we might be posing by developing in that area. And I think I can say broadly that what we're really focused on is looking at ways that we can use natural systems and landscape design to address infrastructural issues rather than more hardscaped engineering heavy solutions. So we're really excited to share some of that new information with you at the next touch point. And I hope those of you who are particularly concerned about that will engage with us as we try to find a happy middle in that area. So our next question, it's a great one. And I think Mila and Danya, both of you might have something to add here. Someone brought up commuter rail and rail travel in general, how, that's a separate process that's happening. So how can we anticipate that infrastructure coming online separate from this? And in these planning and design processes, prepare to try and align those as well as we can.
Thank you for the question. It's a good one. Commuter rail is another project that is included in the adopted Wake Transit Plan. It is a project that is managed by Go Triangle, the same way that the City of Raleigh is a project sponsor for bus rapid transit. Go Triangle is a project sponsor for commuter rail. We are coordinating on a regular basis with Go Triangle to ensure that there's open communication and timely updates so that both teams know the most relevant information and can proceed accordingly. While all of these projects, BRT and commuter rail, are in the Wake Transit Plan, I just want to highlight that they are independent projects. They don't depend on each other for success. So while coordination is critical and important, there's also, I just want to make sure that the projects are programmed into the plan because they all have independent utility, meaning that they all can be successful standalone transit projects.
Great. So our next question, I think for Kyle and John, going back to the land use analysis and the TOD analysis, I think this is more kind of a means and methods questions. People are curious if your analysis, what the balance is between assuming new development and retaining existing development. Particularly, people are concerned and asking if the housing numbers that were presented as part of this update include existing housing, or is that just new housing?
So I can start with that question, Austin. Thank you. So the numbers referenced during the presentation were, sort of net new growth that would be occurring. So this would be growth primarily taking place on, as was noted, vacant sites, non-residential sites, and would represent new development. So in the TOD scenario, where the TOD policy toolkit is assumed to be in place, including the density bonus that would be available, there's higher development that can be achieved.
Great. So Mila, we have a few more questions about funding. I think people are particularly curious about if the projects do receive FTA funding, what exactly does that funding cover? And then what funding would need to come from other traditional city revenue streams like our capital improvement or CIP plan? And primarily, how much of the cost would potentially be passed on to taxpayers?
Bus rapid transit projects included in the Wake Transit Plan. The financial model assumes 50% of the funding will come from the Wake Transit Plan, which is mostly half-cent sales tax and some vehicle revenue vehicle tax dollars. So there are smaller revenue sources. And 50% or potentially more depending on the project could come from the federal government. Again, the federal grant is a discretionary grant, so projects across the country compete for the same pot of money. It's highly competitive and it's not guaranteed. Some of the elements that are included in the project are obviously running ways like BRT, dedicated infrastructure, BRT lanes, stations. We know that stations have various amenities. They plan to have level boarding, off-board payments, transit signal priority technology that is used to make sure that buses stay on schedule and don't fall behind. So those are elements that are directly linked to the project and eligible for funding. Additionally, some components of pedestrian infrastructure could be eligible. However, we would need to show that they're directly linked to the project.
Great. And quickly, as a follow-up to that, there were some questions that if by some chance the federal funding were to fall through, what does that do to these projects?
That would have to be a larger conversation with all Wake Transit Plan partners because there are multiple projects in the program and it's a balancing act what gets funded. So it will have to be reconsidered at a larger forum with all voting members at the table.
Great, thanks, Mila. So Danya, there were a couple questions about the city's ongoing internal TOD planning processes. And I think there are kind of two overarching questions here. One is, at what point do we move a little further away the physical planning of BRT itself and start to look at TOD specifically adjacent to the BRT. But also we got some questions about regarding if there were any current plans as part of the TOD process that is going through the city council right now, if there are plans for blanket upzoning in this area.
Okay, yeah, that's a two-part question, really. So first off, I want to say that's right. So this process is really focused on the corridor and at very high level, right? But I want to give heads up that we are going to go and talk a little bit more specific about station area nodes through what is called the station area planning process. So the first one in line is the Newbern corridor, and Mila can talk. We just got a federal grant to do TOD planning for the Newbern corridor. So we will have a similar process that we want to do also for the Western corridor, which essentially means that we will have a more zoomed in planning and design process for these specific station nodes, which may be a quarter to half mile around the specific transit nodes. Now, the question about TOD. Yes, so we have been doing a lot of work on that. I think we have been following up. The comprehensive plan recently got amended to adopt some transit supportive policies, right? So that's the first step. And there's a lot of discussion about TOD as a zoning district. So if you've been keeping track of the EDAT or equitable development around transit, and Kyle kind of talked about it, there are recommendations for two types of TOD. TOD districts or zones, and those are zoning tools. And we do have a zoning tool right now in our books, which is also a transit overlay district, but we have never applied that to any properties. So essentially it's a floating zoning district, but the intent and the direction given by council in a recent meeting where the equitable development transit around transit recommendations is for staff to start the process to look at updating or refining the TOD zoning district tool. So yes, in the near future, we are going to start that process of looking at how to redefine the TOD zoning tool. Specific recommendations, there was with the previous council, there was some topic or discussion about applying the existing TOD along a certain segment of the Western Boulevard corridor, I think especially between Blue Ridge and I-40, I think. So that little stretch where we have been seeing a lot of transformation. However, with the pandemic and all of that happened, it wasn't one of the council committees. And I think my colleague Jason Harden was the one leading that. The last report we had to the council was to hold off on any overlay at this point until we get to a point of defining what that tool could be, especially with all the recommendations coming out of the EDAT. We want to make sure we redefine it before we go ahead and apply it so that it's not a tedious task, because if we apply an existing one and we know in the near future we're going to redefine and apply it again. So that conversation is happening, and I believe there is the TOD discussion or the zoning tool discussion has been deferred to one of the council committees. I have to check on which committee and what date it might come up for discussion. So yes, stay tuned. We are going to hear a lot about TOD, whether it's zoning or whether it's around planning and designing for station nodes. You're going to see a lot of that over the next few years as we move and do the same for all of the 4 corridors essentially. So I hope that answers your question.
Great, I think that was perfect, Anya. Mila, our next question is for you. We got several questions about kind of the sequence of these projects. So we've got 4 BRT corridors. I think the question is 2 parts. One is, what is the overall priority of Western Boulevard in the context of the other 3 corridors? And in terms of construction, will construction happen one by one, or will there be some overlap between the construction of these systems?
So first is about the priority. The first corridor that was put into the federal pipeline and we initiated design is Newbern. And that was done largely due to available right of way, and compared to other projects, that project was less technically complex. Not to say it's easy, but less difficult than others. So we felt that the team could focus on this project and deliver it faster. Apologize for background noise. Joys of working at home. So the second two projects, we always envisioned that Southern and Western will move on parallel tracks, and the order that they will be put into the federal pipeline will be determined by technical work. Right now, we're seeing that Western is getting a little bit more advanced because we have a locally preferred alternative identified. We are still working through that on the Southern corridor. So at this point, Western corridor is moving into the federal process and design as the second corridor. Southern corridor will move into the federal process once we identify the LPA, locally preferred alternative, and then the program will be concluded by the final fourth project, which is the Northern corridor. And can you remind me the second part of the question?
You got them both.
Okay, all right. I thought
Good
you
job.
were about the construction. So again, the order of construction and whenever that happens is largely contingent upon federal funding and the funding availability.
Yeah. So we're right at 8 o'clock. So this we initially planned to go through from 7 to 8, but we are going to keep going and try and get through all of the questions. So the next one, I think for maybe Morven, Danya, and Mila, a lot of people had questions about how these new, advanced BRT lines are going to fit in with our traditional bus service, whether it be Go Raleigh, Go Cary, Go Triangle. So if all of you, any of you could speak to, as part of the system planning process, are we already looking at changes that can be made to go to the other Go Triangle systems so that they support this BRT system and make those critical connections in a way that's seamless?
I can take this one. The short answer is yes. So the way the plan was developed, all services are designed to complement each other. For example, in the case of BRT, there is a lot of effort to ensure that for example, start and end point of the line, well, typically end of the line, we have park and ride presence or enhanced transit center so that other local and regional services can connect. For example, in the case of Western BRT, it will connect from downtown Raleigh to downtown Cary. Downtown Cary is currently looking at opportunities to establish downtown Cary multimodal transit facility. So wherever that comes to fruition, BRT would be connecting to that infrastructure, linking to other services. The same way with downtown Raleigh, BRT will be connecting to Go Raleigh Station, where we have a lot of presence of local service and regional service. It's our highest ridership station, and the network basically designed to function as the spine for the system, linking to other Go Raleigh and Go Triangle services, as well as Go Cary and other partners.
Great, thanks, Mila. So our next question that was asked both on the Western survey and in the chat, and I think Mila and Danya, this might go to the city. The process of acquiring the right-of-way, what does that process generally look like? People who are concerned about right-of-way acquisition, who can they get in touch with to maybe get a fuller picture of that process?
I think we can probably follow up on this question after the meeting and make sure that we coordinate with other departments that would be helping us in this process, like real estate and legal.
Great, thanks for that clarification. So I think we have two questions left. Morven, as part of the LPA consideration process, I think people are curious to what extent available right-of-way and right of way that would need to be acquired, how that was kind of weighted into that thought process, how important was that into the decision-making process compared to just general public engagement?
Yeah, I mean, certainly for the East Chatham alternative, the right-of-way constraint with the railroad was a major factor, right, that we talked about earlier. Right-of-way availability on the remaining two alternatives that we looked at, Chapel Hill and Carytown, was both reasonably good on both of those alternatives. I'd say that was a neutral factor in deciding between those two. And so ultimately our analysis showed that it was supporting transit-dependent populations and connecting to ridership to generate overall ridership and success on the system that led to the preferred route.
Great, thanks for that, Morven. Two more questions. Mila, will the BRT infrastructure, will that be squeezed into the current right-of-way available on the corridor? Will we have brand new roads, or are we gonna have a mix of both when this gets installed?
This question will be answered at a later phase of the project when we initiate design. Typically, to be conservative and mindful of the budget, we are trying to stay within the existing right-of-way as much as possible. Sometimes in the areas where we have stations, we might need to acquire additional right-of-way. But again, that will come into play once we initiate design.
Great, thanks, Mila. And my last question is from one person who asked this question, I believe I saw on social media, and it didn't make it into the survey, but I think it's a good question to end on, which is all of you work very closely on this project in your day-to-day, you're very involved in it. I think someone asked on social media, what one thing excites each of you the most about BRT coming to Raleigh? And we can start with Mila.
It's a completely new mobility option for the residents, visitors. It's more, it's a little bit different. So anytime you bring something new, it's always, there's a little bit of hesitation, but there's also a lot of excitement. So it's great to see that the county is investing into transit and high quality, high capacity transit that will serve existing riders as well as attract new riders.
Great, thanks, Mila. Danya?
Wow, I wonder who asked that question, because that's a very good question. I guess I'm a planner and designer, so I have to say I'm excited for the opportunities that it brings to our region, especially as we grapple with all of the growth and the associated challenges, right from affordable housing to easy access. We're dealing with traffic. So I don't think I'm just excited that finally, after years of having talked about transit investments and improvements, we have gotten to a point where we have something more tangible and we have a plan and we are rolling with it. So I think that's a great milestone for a region. And again, as it can only get better with more mobility options, because we are growing as a region, and to be able to accommodate that growth and still be successful as a great city that we have always been proud of, and not just city, I don't want to be selfish, but as a region, we seem to attract, talents and folks moving into the area. So for us to be able to continue to be as a very successful city, I think this is very, very important. And I think we are moving in the right direction. So I think I'm very excited for that.
Great, thanks, Danya. Morven?
Yeah, so I'm a Cary resident. I moved here in 2010. And I moved from the Bay Area of California, where I was happily car-free and 100% transit commuter out there. So I'm excited at the possibility of getting onto this new premium transit service in the Triangle and being able to connect to other destinations in Cary and being able to collect to Dorothy Dix Park, Pullen Park, and downtown Raleigh by transit. I think that's a huge opportunity for the region.
Great, thanks, Morven. John?
Thank you. I just want to second that. That was a really great question. So as an urban designer, someone who loves to walk and loves transit, I think what's really exciting is that transportation drives land use, right? So if you build highways, people drive. If you build transit, people can walk and bike, right? So I'm excited to see the connection between transportation and land use happening up front. What I think really excites me about this project is the fact that Raleigh is building not just a bus rapid transit line, but by building the 4 corridors is building a full system. And I think that is really, really exciting. So thanks.
Great. Thanks, John. And Kyle.
So I would echo what everyone else is saying, but also just really emphasize that I'm particularly excited about what's coming along with transit, and it is the equitable development around transit toolkit, and what that's been articulated in the Equitable Transit-Oriented Development Guidebook. I think that the policies that Raleigh has put on the table are really leading in a national context in terms of its very intentional focus and recognizing that transit increases the desirability of an area, can lead to prices, could lead to displacement. And developing a toolkit like this with really powerful tools, in terms of preserving affordability, creating funding streams for affordable housing, for businesses, is really exciting. And it will, if done well, I think can become a national model for other cities who are doing investments like this.
Great, thanks, Kyle. So we are out of time and we're out of questions. So it's the perfect time to wrap this up. I'd like to, again, thank all of you who attended for your engagement this evening. It's really important for us to hear from you and understand what you're thinking about as we move into this final phase, because we want to be sensitive to your concerns as we move into making official recommendations on this plan. So thank you for being engaged tonight, and I hope that you will continue to be engaged. I'd also like to thank our panelists for their time and expertise. I think it's really beneficial for the public to be able to talk to all of you and hear your specialized perspectives. A few last things. As I mentioned earlier, an FAQ will be posted in the coming weeks, and that FAQ is going to answer some questions that we received on the survey, some general questions that we received through various sources, whether they be phone calls, emails, and the like, and also any questions that were asked tonight that could be maybe more fully addressed, some additional information provided to all of you to fully answer your questions. If you haven't, we would greatly appreciate you reviewing the new engagement content. So raleighnc.gov/BRT, you'll click Western Boulevard, and we have some great videos there to walk you through this content. And please take the survey. Let us know what you think of this content. Let us know what you think about BRT, about Western Boulevard, what you're excited about, what scares you. You can take the survey on the page you're viewing us on right now. If you just scroll down, if you're ready to take the survey, you can go ahead and do that. And while you're on the Western BRT page, please sign up to receive updates from Gov Delivery. As this project enters its final phase, that's one of the best ways to keep in touch and hear directly from us when we have some new content available for you. And with that, I'll just say thank you all, and I hope you all have a great night.